Hi, I'm Christine Madera, and I'm the author of the novel God and Drag, and I'm here with Henry Sullivan, author of the novel Colosseum, and we get together every 2 weeks to talk about things that are interesting to us, sometimes philosophical, sometimes cultural, sometimes AI, sometimes other things, and today's topic is, what does virtue look like? And Henry chose this topic, so I'm actually gonna hand it over to Henry and ask you, why did you choose this topic?
Well, I chose this topic because I've been thinking a lot about virtue because it seems as though we're surrounded by, all the
Hmm.
corruption and all of the bad behavior that we see online and all it's just and so it kind of made me think, well, what does virtue actually look like and why is it that we're so mired in vice right now? And it seems as though our society doesn't seem to value. Why is it so hard for virtue to kind of break through? It sort of reminded me, I lived in Chicago for 20 years. And like, I don't know if you've ever been to Chicago and watched the evening news in Chicago, but it tends to have a lot of stories about homicides and robberies and stuff like this, and it just makes it feel as though like the whole city is pretty wild, almost like the Wild Wild West.
Yeah.
And so I was in Minnesota for the weekend, one year, and I was really struck by how, like, I was watching the nightly news, and this particular broadcast, I don't know if this is common. I was in Bemidji, Minnesota. I don't know if you've ever heard of Bemidji, Minnesota. And they did a like 10 to 15-minute story on this little boy who decided that morning that he wanted to buy popsicles and just walk around town and give them away.
Hmm.
And so they interviewed him, they interviewed his parents, they interviewed like his neighbors, other kids, they had like this footage of him walking around giving popsicles away to people. They did that. And I mean, after like watching local news in Chicago for over a decade, it was just amazing to see that, but it's the kind of thing that you just is really
Hmm.
unusual to see that sort of thing nowadays. And I'll give props to some people. Like I remember before he went off the air, I forget what his name was, who was the anchor for the nightly news for NBC Nightly News.
Brian Williams ages ago, or Lester Holt more
Lester
recently?
Holt. Lester Holt.
Lester Holt. Okay.
Who, by the way, was kind of made his name in Chicago because if you were called to jury duty, all of the
Hmm.
video kind of instructions, that's Lester Holt.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, that's Lester Holt. And so I remember he tried to do this thing of, I think it was like Moment of Joy, or he
Mm.
intentionally tried to insert like good stories at the end of the broadcast.
Yeah.
And I've seen other people try to do that. Nicole Wallace tries to do
Yeah.
that she's tried to do stuff like that, but it always seems like they're forcing it in. It's almost like they're like making a point to do it. It's not like they do it in such a way that makes me think that there really isn't much demand for that type of thing. And
Hmm.
and so that's why I've just been thinking about, are we going to have this period where it just seems as though vice rules and people will just get tired of that, and we'll eventually get to the point where people want to hear positive stories again, where those are the stories that break through, and the stories that don't break through are bad news stories.
Yeah. Well, I mean, vice sells. It's just like the whole outrage economy in the news
Right.
cycles.
Hmm.
Whatever gets more clicks, whatever gets more shares, whatever gets more traction in terms of people getting eyeballs on a video, or, clicks in TikTok or YouTube or whatever. So, I mean, I think that's some of it, but I think we've been conditioned. I mean, we've been conditioned to that in a way. I mean, we have that initial, to me, response to things that are threatening, that they capture our attention immediately. Things that are
Hmm.
safe are kind of part of the environment. things that capture our attention immediately are the things that are dangerous. And we've sort of become hyper aware of those things. And that's been jacked up in the news so that now all we do is really hear about those things that continue to jack that up. So, and I don't know, because I remember there was what was it called? Back when you could order videos from Netflix, there was another video place that had all feel-good spiritual type videos and stories, and you paid your monthly thing, you got 3 per month, and I can't remember the name of it. And it never really took off in the same way because, the stories, they took a little bit more to think about. They took a little bit more with nuance. It required you to be able to sit quietly for an hour and a half and watch a story versus having your emotions, jacked up over and over again. And I don't know if they stuck around for a long time or how well they did. And I think, it's interesting because Vice is kind of like that thing that captures our attention. But virtue is the things that we try to build into our immediate life. Like, we don't want to be surrounded in our immediate life by vice-filled people, mostly. I mean, some people do probably, but mostly we want to be surrounded by virtuous people. So it's a real disconnect between, how we want our lives sculpted in our personal relationships and, what we give our attention to in the larger world. So I don't know. I mean, I know I've stopped watching the news. If things are too violent, I don't watch them. Like, I try to train my eyeballs on things that aren't trying to capture that nervous system response, just to be able to hold my eyeballs on something. So I've tried to be intentional about that. And I know people who are doing that, but I don't think we're in the majority. I think we are in the minority. And I don't know how you make that swing back from vice to virtue, because there is all this thrill. Like, even as a writer, like, this, people live vicariously through stories. And there's a little bit of a thrill to live vicariously through the vice of characters, whether it's on a screen or in a book or something like that, where you can experience those things without actually indulging in those things.
Right.
So there might be a little bit of that as well, right? You don't want to be a bank robber in real life, hopefully, but the thrill of it on a page might be kind of fun. I don't know. So I'm not sure how to answer that, but I do think that most people prefer virtue in the sense of just like niceness and calmness. Like, I think virtue sometimes has a bad rap because it's like it expects so much of us that we're supposed to be perfect and good and not have a bad thought and not do anything that's, a little viceful. Like, I think it has its own baggage. So I'm not sure. But back to you.
Well, you said a couple of things that are interesting. One, you said you don't know how many other people feel a certain way, like about virtue. And that's an interesting question. I mean, is it the case that virtue is just quiet and vice is just loud? Or at least right now, is that the case? And it might be the case that there are a bunch of people out there, like there might be something closer to a majority of people who are actually interested in more positivity. It's just that since no one's really talking about it, it's hard to really gauge that,
right.
And the other thing that struck me, I was listening to a podcast, and one thing that the person said makes a lot of sense. So, and the way that I'll explain it is this way: I remember in our early conversations, you talked about this world that you were working on, where it's a little bit of a, I don't know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounded like you were basically trying to come up with an alternative to capitalism, where a world in which people would be, you focused on the outcomes where people are happy and they feel fulfilled and everything. And so how do you get to those outcomes by structuring society differently from the way our society is structured right now?
Yeah.
And the reason why I brought it up is, and this was mentioned in this podcast that I'm thinking of, is that if you think about it, there was a time when there was an alternative to the society that we have. And that alternative basically stated, our people are happy. This is the right way to go. People people are more productive in our society. I'm talking about the Soviet Union. And so there was a literal, not only a physical, not like a physical confrontation, but also an ideological battle, which basically created a situation where our elites had something to prove. And it's just like, well, you say that your people are better, but look at us. We have, our women are freer than the women in your country, or the minorities in our country are freer than minorities in your country. We have a better judicial system and all this other kind of stuff. And so, we don't have, like, if we take your world, Christinistan, where it's an alternative to the system that we have now, and you basically you convince a country to become Christinistan, and you say, hey, look, well, this is the way government should be structured, just like our government is structured. Our outcomes are great. They're better for families. They're better for the mental health. They're better for personal enrichment. Then there might be some incentive for the leaders in our country to actually try to produce those outcomes, or at least work harder to produce those outcomes, because they have something to prove, because Christinistan might take over the world. Everybody might want to have implement the policies in Christinistan. But right now, everyone has some form of capitalism. China has some form of capitalism.
Yeah. They do.
Russia, you might call it like a mob state, but it's a form. Yeah. I mean, we can't criticize Russia's form of capitalism, because our form of capitalism looks a whole lot like it.
Right. Yeah.
But there is no Christinistan basically saying, I have an alternative way of structuring society that produces better outcomes. There is no such place. You see what I'm saying?
No, I totally get what you're saying. That's why I'm like fantasizing in this book series, because I think it's an interesting thought process to go through to see how things could be structured. Because the whole premise of my society that I was building for this series was, what would a society look like? How would it be structured if the dominant values were personal and collective well-being versus, the movement of capital and the hierarchy and structure of those things? Like, how would that actually be structured? What might it look like? What would people do? How would they feel fulfilled? All of that kind of stuff. But it was really a worldwide structure, and it kind of the importance of governments in that structure kind of went away, because this was about something that moved through the systems that people built versus the systems that government has built. And I think, one of the big questions when it comes to government and how government creates systems is that, are any of them really for our collective or the well-being of, all of us who are not billionaires, basically at this point, for ordinary people? Because there's always a story about, so I was looking at, the rise and fall of systems of government. Like, it doesn't matter which system it was, but, while it's growing and it needs people to be involved and buy into the dream and do the work and all of that, like, the trade-off is that they need healthy people. So they need to be sure that there's good infrastructure for food and that kids who are hungry get fed. They need educated people. So they need schools, they need universities, they need these things, but they're not doing it for our benefit. They're doing it for the benefit of the system. And then when you get to a place where, and welfare, I don't mean welfare, welfare states, generally speaking, and social welfare stuff and social security and retirements, all of those stuff go along with the building phase of something, because they need more and more people who buy into that system. And then when you get to a place like where we are now, where fewer and fewer people are the big beneficiaries of the system, and it does not need people as much as it did, and programs are cut, things are cut, and it doesn't really matter what happens to us at this point, because we're not needed anymore. So none of those things that are put in place as a system of government, no matter what that government is, or an economic system, no matter what that economic system is not put in place for our benefit. It's for the benefit of the system. It just looks like our benefit for a while. So for mine, I was looking at, if those systems broke down and we created these different systems from scratch, and our collective value was personal and collective well-being, how would we create systems that actually brought that about without there being some kind of top-down hierarchical class that was ruling everything. So anyway, and it's still a question, there's still parts of me that are like, yeah, that part of that system wouldn't work anyway. But it was my thought experiment during COVID as I was walking around trying to figure out how could you restructure something or unstructure something or create a new structure based on values that actually benefited the well-being of people and are personally and collectively rather than the well-being of the systems that we are part of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, it is sort of interesting because early on in this conversation about artificial intelligence, it seems as though leaders in enterprise were almost gleeful at the idea of laying off large parts of the workforce.
Right after they said, oh, AI is going to save the world,
Right.
and we're going to have this wonderful thing for humanity, but we're going to lay everybody off. So it'll work itself
Exactly.
out. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so it became, I mean, it wasn't so much a slip, but it became really obvious that these people don't really like employees. It's just like if I could have a
Right.
corporation
Yeah.
without people, then I would be really, really happy. And so
Yeah.
like I said, I think because you can't discount the impact of the people in power on the overall society, even if you personally disagree with them. They
Right.
still have a lot of influence on society as a
Mhm.
whole.
Yeah.
And especially if they're not really competing to be good in the commons sort of sense of the word, like good
Yeah.
for the greater good. They're
Right.
competing to have more money, or they're competing to have more power, or they're competing to have more influence. They're not really competing, so that for more and more people to view them as good people. In fact,
Right.
it seems as though some of them are competing for more and more people to view them as bad people because that's cool. And that
Yeah.
kind of goes back to what I was
Well,
saying about
I was
how it
watching.
just, go ahead.
I was going to say that I was watching this thing today that talked about how when they were doing brain scans of people and that the brains of, we would call them billionaires now, but people for whom there are no consequences. When you have
Mhm.
enough power and money that you have no consequences, it actually changes your brain structure so that you don't operate in the same way that we all operate, the rest of us operate in a space, maybe not of virtue, but of a certain level of reciprocity. Like I expect you to basically follow the law so that I basically follow the law so that everything moves forward. And I bring this back to traffic laws. Like if we were all running amok on the streets, there'd be a lot of dead people and ruined cars. But if I trust that you and most people are generally following traffic rules that I can anticipate, and that I generally follow the traffic rules that you can anticipate, things continue to move. But if you are somebody for whom there are no consequences, you can just run your Cybertruck over everybody, and it doesn't really matter, and creates this whole mess of things. But but the story, what I wanted actually to say in the beginning was the story that all of these guys told, always guys, the story that they all told in the beginning was how wonderful it was going to be for humanity. They told us the Jetsons story.
Mhm.
We're moving into this future, we're going to have all
Mhm.
this stuff, and the people won't need to work anymore. Everybody's going to have an income. We're all just going to relax around. And yet they didn't want to participate in that story. They just wanted to capitalize on that story.
Right.
So it doesn't really, what really happens to most of us, because the story is all about winning and making the most money and the shareholders and the whole thing. I don't know. The whole thing really doesn't make any sense, because if you don't have people, then ultimately that game goes away regardless. It seems like there's this weird psychosis where that's completely divorced from any kind of potential reality. And it's all like, well, this is a story we're telling ourselves about what winning AI might be like. And then if we don't need people and we've, basically none of them have jobs, then, we'll just figure that out later on, or, whatever it is. But the whole thing, when you look at it, things aren't connected to each other. So it just still seems like a house of cards to me.
Well, that definitely, that's another thing I've thought a lot about recently, which is, I mean, because to be honest with you, I thought that we would be seeing a much more dramatic financial collapse a lot sooner than this. Because, I mean, if you think about it, when was the last time in our lifetime we were living in a country with a war, with tariffs on every country in the world, a lot of political instability? We not that long ago we had a pandemic. Not many years before that, we had a global financial crisis. I mean, it just seems as though we're living in this building that's had like all of this stress on it. And it's hard to believe that the building hasn't collapsed sooner, that it's taking so long for the building to collapse. And I've kind of come to the conclusion that what it is that the financial system, at least, is become so separate from reality, the stock market and everything else, that really all you have to do is just treat it like a game. So like recently when Scott Bessent had the US government purchase billions of dollars of Japanese yen, it's just like, well, what we needed to do that because given all of the other pieces in the financial system, that would basically prop up something else so that everything won't collapse. I mean, it kind of goes to what I was saying 2 weeks ago, which is you've got like 7 companies in the stock market that are basically loaning each other billions of dollars, and they're just passing that loan around to the point where it comes back to the last person as income, and then they just do it all over again, and they just keep passing it around. And it seems like that wouldn't be sustainable, but at the same time, if the whole thing is contrived, in other words, if it's all BS.
Yeah, it's all a game, and everybody just keeps playing the game in ways that they can
exactly. Exactly. And if everybody's in on the game, then why would it collapse? As long as, I mean, if it's literally all up in the air, then what's going to cause it to fall down? And it really does feel like that's the situation that we're in. Not that our concrete circumstances are not being impacted by all this. They are. If you look at the jobs report this morning, it's like, we lost 23,000 jobs in July. And I mean, probably more than that, but it's not surprising that July was a job loss month and not a job gain month. That's not surprising at all,
But I think at that meta level of playing this game, there's a lot of things going on to prop up the system. So a couple of things that were like when the original part of the Iran war, when it seemed like we were going to be running out of oil at a particular thing, like, that by summertime, by July, there was going to be no jet fuel. There was going to be all these different things, and all this collapsed because of the way that things were structured. Well, China basically stopped importing oil, and other players began to shift things around so that there would not be this massive squeeze. And so like buying up the yen, there was something so that would not be that massive squeeze. And all these AI companies propping up each other, which is interesting because I was listening to Patrick Boyle, and he was making the case that all of these companies are priced as if each of those companies is going to be the winner in the AI race. But there's probably only going to be one winner. So what happens to the rest of them? But since they're all so interconnected, it might not be as much of a stumbling block as it might be if they were completely disconnected. So I think the players in the games are trying to keep the stability going at a certain level so they can continue to make money. But also because going into any kind of a global recession or global depression is not good for any of them and not good for anybody. So I think at that upper level game, things are just kind of played out, and, we're going to fix this scenario. We're going to do this thing. We're going to do this thing until at some point it might collapse, or maybe something will happen where things begin to transform in a different way. But yeah, it's been interesting to watch. Like, well, this is a crisis coming, and then, no. But now we're back at war with Iran again. And if nothing gets through the Strait of Hormuz and there's still this oil gap, that might, we might still have another kind of shock later on in the fall because everybody's running out of reserves, and all the things that were cobbled together to keep it going are kind of dwindling. So who knows?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and honestly, I think that oil is the thing that will wind up doing it, because oil is an actual physical commodity, and there is a literal amount of oil out there. It's not like that's not a number you can make up.
Right.
And so it seems like that's the thing that might bring it all down. And then that brings me back to the question is, okay, so how will actual people in the literal trillions all around the world. How are they going to react to that? Because like in the U.S., I mean, the theme that's been going through the entire war with Iran is Iran can handle a lot more pain than Americans. Like, that's the thing about going back to what you were saying about your brain being sort of wired in a way based on the fact that you're not going to suffer any consequences. And, here in North America, we don't have hostile neighbors. The idea, we know Mexico and Canada are not going to attack us. We know that.
Right. Yeah.
So we don't actually need to defend ourselves against those two countries, so we can go all the way to another part of the world and people don't. Well, I mean, people have been against the war from the beginning. So I definitely want to, note that. But at the same time, the actual real grumbling won't happen until gas prices go over $5 a gallon or whatever.
Yeah. Where they're not already.
Yeah, exactly. I guess they are in certain places. I mean, because we're always talking about the average when we say $4.20 or whatever. It's always the average. But it really brings it back to, are people going to look for more virtue in their lives if and when things become really bad, or are people just going to double down on vice? What's going to happen? It's hard to say.
Well, and I think you have different kinds of people that respond in different situations. You've got the people, like if you just break it down into people whose first inclination is to fight, there's this constant thing, I've got to go out and battle. I need to take my gun everywhere. I need to do this. I need to do that. Everything is about fighting. Those people are probably going to respond with more of those kinds of vices. But I would imagine during the pandemic and during other times that more people would become somewhat more virtuous, because in times of crises, we need each other. I know in living through Helene, we were ground zero for Helene, and it was, people wouldn't have survived without neighbors. Like my little condo complex, we were doing things like, I assigned myself the job of hauling pool water to people so we could flush our toilets. And I had a kid who was going to help me because he needed volunteer hours for to get his high school diploma, and he couldn't, school was out for a month and a half. And so I was his volunteer director. And so he helped me with that. And other people assigned themselves other things. And we all worked together to be sure that neighbors who needed food got food, that people who needed water got water. And we were not unusual. That was the, all around here, that was the theme, is everybody was helping everybody, because nobody had electricity, nobody had water, nobody had any of these things. And the way that you kind of have the social security in the deeper sense is that you have a secure social safety net, with your friends and your neighbors, and not just isolating yourself from people. So I think under stress, you have people who become crazed. And there were some of those people, in Helene too, that kind of went over the edge. But you had more people who were like, this is now where I really need to tap into my community and become more community minded. So I would hope that more people would become like that. I don't know.
Well, the other conversation that I've heard on different podcasts, and it's usually an aside, which is someone might mention that in their network, they know people who believe that since they volunteer at food pantries on Saturday, that it's okay that they spend the rest of the week basically cursing people out online,
right?
And attacking people online. That one day of volunteering at the food pantry kind of absolves them of all the horrible things they say to strangers on Twitter and Facebook and whatnot.
Right.
And so I think that might contribute to this sense that there's way more vice than virtue, because normally if somebody's saying some nasty thing, some stranger saying some nasty thing to you on social media, the last thing you imagine that same person doing is volunteering at a food pantry on once that week.
And chances are that person is not using their real name. Like I think the whole that this.
Oh no, they're not using their real name. No.
So in Christinistan, right, the iteration of the World Wide Web or whatever internet, it's a whole different thing. It's kind of gone through some different variables, because that you, for the one that everybody uses as public facing, you have to use your name, you have to be yourself in that sphere. And like that part, that's the good behavior sphere where, you know, you interact with people and you have got to be that kind of upstanding person. And there's other ways for people to be, you know, more anonymous and doing gaming and things like that. But that has been one of the huge things I think that has allowed a lot of this online vice to proliferate, or the online violence and social media to proliferate, is that people are able to not operate under their own identity. And if they were out there with their own identity and their bosses and their friends and their neighbors were seeing what they were writing, like that's a way for people to have a constraint against that, because we see that in when people are uncovered, that they lose jobs, they lose friends, they lose family members. And so having that kind of social responsibility is one way that we control ourselves from becoming completely unhinged online.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. So you're saying in Christinastan, I forget the name of the world that you
it doesn't really have, so there's a novel name, but it doesn't, the world itself doesn't have a different name. It's not Christinastan. It's the world as it is in this book.
Okay. So you were saying, because I do vaguely remember, because this was when we first started talking actually, and you, I remember you saying something about there being, like, as part of the commons, there's a virtual dimension to the commons. And so everyone basically has an ID that they use to contribute, to receive information, to share information, and so on.
Yeah.
And I agree that if the only way that you could interact online was as your real self, kind of like, you know, all of the constraints that we have in real life, where you can buy a fake ID card or whatever, but, you know, you got to go through a lot of trouble to do it.
Yeah.
So what most people have is their actual driver's license or their actual passport or whatever. And it would be the same way online, where, you know, you can go through all of the, you know, all of the hoops to get a phony ID, but it's not nearly as easy as it is right now. Right now it's literally easy, you know. You can have multiple identities online if you want to.
Totally. And like, so in the what I was envisioning, you know, kind of like where I would like to be is that we have a sphere where it's the public, online, digital, virtual sphere, where it is this large community where you are yourself in that community. And, you know, that's your public facing thing. It's how you get your, you know, money to live or whatever it happens to be. And there are other avenues because people need some other kinds of outlets, but everybody knows, like, but you don't have to use those outlets. Like right now, all we have is the one internet and the dark web and social media as it is, where, you know, you can show up as your regular self. You can say something, you can have all these trolls, you know, bounce on you for that. And you can't get away from it. Your only option is really to leave or to confine your internet or your social media to, you know, certain people. Like on my Facebook, I've got it down to just only my friends can see what I say, mostly because I don't interact with anybody on Facebook anymore anyway. But I just got tired of everything being out there, and I just made it so that I can only interact with my friends. But right now we don't have a choice, really. If you're going to interact on social media or socially online, you have to interact with the madness.
Yeah, and I also think that I remember a couple of years ago watching a podcast where someone was saying humanity wasn't really built to know everything all at once and to be able to see everyone all at once. So, I mean, because right now, because I don't really have a television, I just have a YouTube account. And so on YouTube, you can literally go through and see, you know, cat video, dog video, earthquake in Manila, you know, uprising in this country,
right?
You know, mass shooting in this city. You just literally just scroll through, and like sometimes the videos are right next to each other. So the cat video is right next to, like, you know, the 100 people that were killed in some, you know, and it's just, it does seem, when you think about it, there does seem to be something a bit unnatural about that, you know, is totally different from what it was like to grow up. I mean, I can only imagine what what kids are like nowadays, because that's the world that they know.
Yeah.
Is a world with all of this stuff happening all at the same time. But growing up, it was totally different. I mean, it just almost feels like we grew up in cocoons
Oh,
compared to
totally.
the way we live now.
Yeah. Well, and so another thing about that I really in Christina stands, if we're going to call it that, that I think is missing in what we have now is a sense of community. Like we've all gone online for our communities, but you
Hmm.
also really need to be enmeshed in your local community. And so then this world that I created, like that, you have to interact with your local community because that's how you get like your local. It's called Universal Basic Standard of Living, UBSL. So, and for your housing, for your food, for all that kind of stuff, all your basic necessities come from your local community. So you plugged into your local community for a certain amount of hours each week, and that keeps you connected to your local community. And then the rest of the time, and you've got like this huge time dividend to do other things. And so you can do more virtual community in other places. But I think we have kind of neglected our local communities, and even with local communities kind of isolated them more and more, because it used to be, you know, that you in your job, in your school, in your life, you would have to interact with whoever happened to be there. And, you know, we've gotten to be a little bit more siloed in who we are interacting with in person and online. So, you
Hmm.
know, our online, I only want to talk to these people has been replicated for a lot of people in their local community where they don't know their neighbors, but they know the people in this particular group, whether it's a church group or some other group. And that's their whole sense of local community. They don't have to, you know, interact with their neighbors. But I do remember, because when, I don't know about for you, but when I was growing up, like nobody really had any real idea what people's political party was, what their, unless they were really close friends, maybe how much money they were making, you know, like all those things that people are so hyped up about now. What do you believe? You know, how are you demonstrating how much money you have? All of this kind of stuff that seems to be part of the conversation. Oh, and politics. Nobody knew what their politics was, you know? So, but now like that is how we divide each other up. And we find our little micro communities where before it was just like whoever happened to be on your street, that was your community. And I didn't really know what they were all about unless they chose to be really outgoing about that. But now like those are front leading questions and judging whether you're somebody that I want to spend my time with.
Yeah, I definitely think that what you're saying, I mean, when you say growing up, to me, like when I remember as kids that really the divide was much more clearly, it's the reason why the Peanuts was a cartoon that totally made sense, because there was like the interaction with other kids,
Mm-hmm.
which there was some complexity to it, but it was pretty simple compared to, our world as adults.
Yeah.
And then there were adults, and like really, it did sort of feel like the kids were talking, and the adults was just like womp 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 womp.
Yeah.
It didn't really matter what they were saying,
Uh-huh.
And I think that's the reason why that made so much sense, is because that's
Uh-huh.
kind of how it really felt. And then
Yeah.
once you got into like the teenage years, there were a couple of different. It's almost like you were at a crossroads of a sort. And then that's when people started
Mm-hmm.
to develop interest. And so if you were a person who, because I played a bunch of sports. I mean, I played every game you could play when I was a kid because I like playing games. And
Mm-hmm.
so the fact that
Mm-hmm.
I don't follow sports now is not because I've never played any sports. To me, sports
Yeah.
were just other games,
Yeah.
but once I got to that crossroads of adolescence, following sports, watching sports, getting connected into, like, getting emotionally invested in players, professional players and teams and all that kind of stuff. None of that stuff had any attraction for me.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas there are a lot of guys in particular that went in that direction. They went down that
Yeah.
path, and then you have the same sort of thing with girls. They'll go down certain paths. And so, but I do agree with you that even with that decision to go down certain paths, you still sort of felt like that person that you played all these games with when you were kids is still essentially in your community. And you didn't
Mm-hmm.
substantially change your idea of, like, right now it feels as though there are people with significantly different character than you. Like it feels as though there are people who literally just have a different standard for who should live, who should die, who values, who matters, how you treat people, who should have a job, who shouldn't have a job. And they're pretty stark, I mean, it's
Mhm.
like, you have people who were just like, well, I feel like if you're human, you should live, and if you're human, you're valued. Then there are other people who are like, no, these people don't matter.
Yeah.
My people do matter. And they're very, very clear about that. I've
Yeah.
seen a ton of videos in different countries with people literally saying that, and it's sort of
Yeah.
jarring to see that, and I think that that's basically how our society has sort of broken down now, where you almost kind of feel like there's this suspicion that people sort of have. Well, are you the kind of person that would literally just that feels that will utter a statement that basically condemns a whole group of people to death?
Mhm.
Or are you the kind of
Yeah.
person that would never utter that kind of statement? And it feels as though you don't necessarily know that. You might have to work with people, but you don't know how they come down on matters like that, with where the stakes are actually pretty high
Yeah.
conceptually. They're not high in terms of your relationship with that person, because you're going to go home and then you're going to come back to work the next day. So the stakes remain the same, but conceptually the stakes are huge.
It is. They are. Yes.
And it seemed, and I don't remember things being that way even in my early adulthood, to tell you the truth. And for me, I met a
Yeah.
lot of different people, because I went from New Orleans, Louisiana to Columbus, Ohio. I mean, in some
Mhm.
ways, I may as well have been in another country. And I still didn't feel quite like that, though. What I just described in terms of people's character being starkly different, that feels relative. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and so much has changed too from the time where and we've talked about this before, when we've had, especially like living in one country, where we had certain things that we had in common. Like, we both watched the Peanuts. We both know what that is. That's a
Right,
common reference that we have.
right.
That, may or may not be a reference that kids have now, but that we had a lot of common reference points. And even if we differed in different ways, we had this place of commonality that where we could interact with each other in a relatively neutral way, where we could see each other as people. We understood, what was happening around us from not a neutral standpoint, but from a collective understanding of what was going on. And now everything is really, not only are we all looking at our own little news silos and fact silos and that kind of stuff, but it has ratcheted up to that point that anybody who doesn't do that is like the other. So there's a threat level that we attach to people who are different than us that I don't think we've attached to the same level before, at the same scope that we have been doing it now. That if you don't believe or think the way that I believe or think, you are automatically suspect. And there was one other thing I wanted to touch on. I subscribe on Substack to Astro MD. I don't know if you get him or not, but Dr. Peter Cummings, but he had a really interesting article. He said very well what I've been trying to say for years and years, not so well, is that, everybody likes certainty. The brain likes certainty because then it can use brain function on other things. And there are certain kinds of personality structures that require more certainty than other personality structures. And so it's a cost if we are not anything less than certain. And so there's an ease when you move into some kind of information silo, that if you can make that your certainty, then all kinds of inner contradictions go away, because you can just sort of default to that certainty, and whatever is part of that network of information within that certainty, you just go along with it, because it saves a lot of mental processing. And there's a lot of mental processing that we have to do. But that the other part of that is, if you can, and the way I phrase this is that if you treat, you know, all of life as kind of a working hypothesis, and what your beliefs are as like a working hypothesis, that you're open to being disproved. It requires a lot more cognitively to be able to stay in that space.
Hmm.
And so, and especially now where there's so much information, to your point, coming at us all of the time, that we're probably not designed to manage, having that kind of personality structure, or choosing that kind of, way of interacting with life, is a lot more cognitively exhausting. So more people are less inclined to do that.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. I mean, because I actually, one of the things that I liked about traveling around the country for work, which meant that I was in the city for longer than a week or whatever, and it
Hmm.
wasn't just for leisure. So in other words, I wasn't only experiencing the city as a tourist. I actually
Hmm.
had to go to the grocery store. And then the job that I had involved me going into people's houses and getting on their roof. I was,
Hmm.
working as an independent adjuster.
Hmm.
And it one of the things I liked about it is I didn't know what was going to happen from day to day, and I didn't know who I was going to
Yeah.
meet from day to day or where I was going to go from day to day. I really liked that, especially since, I'd never been to I mean, I'd been to different parts of Texas. Texas is so big. There's still plenty of parts of Texas that I
Yeah.
haven't seen yet. But I'd never been to New Mexico, I'd
Hmm.
only been to Phoenix briefly, and I'd never been to
Hmm.
California. And so, the whole experience, I liked like doing something different
Yeah.
every day. Traveling gets kind of tiring, and so I'm not saying I
Hmm.
want to go back to that, but at that particular moment in my life, it was really a kind of an exciting thing to do.
Hmm.
And you're right. It's definitely it keeps you on your toes. You have to be on your toes more to pay attention. You
Yeah.
don't know what to
Yeah.
expect. You're constantly doing a lot of translating for people, even though you're all speaking the same language. There are like certain cultural differences depending on where you are. I'd gotten
Hmm.
used to the way were in Chicago. Things are very, very different in the West. People are much more
Yeah.
gregarious in Chicago. Like Chicagoans don't. My experience with Chicagoans
Hmm.
is they don't like silent, dead silence where your uncomfortable silences where you're just sitting there. If you're sitting next to a person or on a train or whatever, a person is likely to say something to you. They're likely to ask you, "Did you see the
Uh-huh.
game or whatever?"
Hmm.
Whereas that does not happen in Phoenix, Arizona. People they're polite,
Right.
but it's kind
Yeah.
of like you have your business, I have my business, and that's it. you know,
Right.
and so you got to sort of, you're right. It takes a lot more out of you to sort of deal with those differences
Yeah.
and deal with constantly learning something new from moment to moment. So
Well, and there's
that's
people
definitely true.
who are like you and me and many other people who are comfortable being in that state of, adapting to whatever the situation is.
Hmm.
And then there's personality structures that where that's very threatening. That if something is different, that, it reads in your nervous system as bad or wrong or something and really kind of uses up a lot of your energy to manage that scenario. And that so you become kind of locked into that, well, this is right, this is wrong, this is good, this is bad, and sort of locked into that space. And those are kind of two different just personality structures. And it's interesting, there's been some different studies on how, whether it's left and right or different kinds of ways that people divide themselves up, that they kind of divide themselves up with people who enjoy novelty and people who feel threatened by novelty and who enjoy structure and sameness and consistency. And then on the novelty, people get totally bored with structure and consistency. And that's sort of a consistent thing and expresses itself in different ways in different cultures, different political systems and things like that. But that's two general ways that people approach the world and can create two entirely that can translate into like political parties and that kind of stuff, because it just is two different ways of people understanding the world, and that is pretty well documented as kind of a dividing personality structure.
Yeah, and that actually brings me to, I guess, the last point I'll make that I think does relate to the whole question about virtue, which is even people, you're rarely ever dealing with just one person. You're always in some
Yeah.
ways dealing with a network. And I think we have this situation now where so many people have people in their network who are sort of the way you describe, where they're very uncomfortable with difference. The world has to be a certain way, and they often they have kind of a bully sort of personality. And so not only do
Hmm.
they feel that way, but they need to sort of bully everybody around them to sort of at least act as if that's the
Yeah.
way they feel, regardless of whether they feel that way or
Right.
not. And I think the impact
Yeah.
of like having a person like that, having one person or a couple of people in the network with people who are not actually like that, is it sort of creates this thing where everyone else is sort of tiptoeing around the hypersensitivity of that
Yeah.
person.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
you know, to me, it really explains because Paul Krugman said something that I thought was very interesting. He was talking about why it's so hard to figure out what's actually going on with people's economic situation nowadays,
Mhm.
because it was less so years ago, because this is a survey that, you know, a couple of different outlets would do going all the way back decades, right? Where they would ask people, how do you feel about the economy and all this kind of
Mhm.
stuff. And it started to become the case at around like the early aughts of this century, where
Mhm.
people, your political affiliation had more impact on what you would say. So if the president was in your political party, you were much more likely to say that things are going well
Yeah.
than
Yeah.
than you were to say that things are going badly. Now, I mean,
Mhm.
obviously, if you've lost your job and you've been out of work for a long time, you're likely to say things are going badly regardless. But he said something that does seem to be true, which is that's not true on both sides. He was like, you know, it seems to him that it's more and more the case that one group of people, they cheer the loudest and they boo the hardest. And
Mhm.
so they're much more likely, if their guy is in office, you know, to say, yeah, it's great. Oh, it's great. Yes, yes, it's great. It's great. It's great. No matter, you know, who asks, no matter what
Yeah.
their situation
Yeah.
is. And if they don't like the guy in office, there's like, boo, it's horrible,
Yeah.
boo. And
No matter if their life's even 10 times better, that it's
I
not due
even
to
saw
that person,
one,
it's due to some
I
other,
even
you
saw,
know.
that's exactly right. I even saw one segment where this guy had a business where like he was installing solar panels, and he said that my business, I wouldn't have this business if it weren't for the stimulus for green energy that the Obama administration put in place. And he was
Mhm.
like, I'm against that legislation and I would be for like repealing it, even though he said
Right,
that
right, right.
that
Yeah.
he was personally benefiting from that very
Right.
legislation. But since he didn't like
Yeah.
Obama, he didn't like the legislation.
Right. Yeah.
But I think that tendency to cheer loudly and boo very loudly, louder than other people of different
Mhm.
persuasions, that explains a whole lot of our society
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah.
You know, and it's just, I'm kind of, on the one hand, I'm kind of hoping that we get out of that, although I don't have like a lot of, you know, optimism that we will. I think it's just natural, you know, because
Right.
the bullies are going to be the bullies and the people around them will tiptoe around them. That's just the way it is, you know, but we'll see. I actually do believe that that's the reason why we have this feeling that there's more of a general malaise, it seems as though, than there's been in like over a decade. Where it's like,
Yeah.
you know, even people who were very, very strident in their beliefs seem to be kind of tired,
Yeah.
unless they're just really
Yeah.
extreme, you
Yeah. I mean,
know?
it's exhausting. Like living and paying attention to particularly politics, but to all of the things happening all of the time is
Hmm.
just exhausting. And I think, you know, people are slowly or maybe not so slowly checking out of that, you know, and they're sort of biding their time to see what else might come up. You know, we kind of, in the US, we kind of put this on election cycles. Well, maybe the next election cycle will have something different. But I mean, the whole thing is kind of the same dance and just sort of changing partners in the dance. But I mean, it could be something really interesting. Like we might have two new, completely different political parties that show up, or, you know, something that really changes the game a little bit. But I think people are just sort of opting out. And I've been thinking about this with birth rate stuff. So, you know, we commented last time, or I commented to you last time that, or maybe the time before, that even though we live in, you know, quote unquote, interesting times, we are at the top of our hour, interesting times in terms of there's a lot going on. Like there's a lot of change, there's a lot of high stakes stuff happening that is not very interesting. Like that it's just so like tediously predictable what's going to happen. And it's getting harder and harder to kind of maintain optimism within the structures as they are now. And so people are opting out in different ways. And one of the ways they're opting out, lots of different reasons, is that people aren't having kids because it's not a very interesting place to bring kids into when there's, everything is becoming so constrained. So I think we're all just kind of sitting around waiting for something interesting to happen so that we can begin to, involve ourselves in life on this planet in new and interesting ways that aren't just being ruled by somebody, where we actually have a say and a personal stake and hope going forward, not just in our own little world, but in the world itself.
Okay. Well, I think that's about as positive as we can get to. Actually, I found that page and Anna Casper did say something. He said Vice
Oh.
was less newsworthy before the 24-hour news cycle.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I guess there's some truth to that. I guess since I'm a news nerd, though, I really liked CNN when it first came out, though. I mean, I used to watch CNN way back in the day when Bernard Shaw was the
Oh, I
anchor.
remember Bernard Shaw, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I just thought it was really cool. I mean, I remember 1 hour when in the same hour, CNN covered, they talked to astronauts that were in the International Space Station. They covered like a story that was in, East Asia. They covered a story that was not in Atlanta. It was in some other part of the United States. And they covered some other story that was in South America because they had correspondents in all these different places.
Right.
And they had the whole network where they could do that. And that was all 1 hour.
Right, but remember in the very beginning of that, when CNN was give us 20 minutes and we'll give you the world. So it was really just covering everything like a regular newscast. And then the thing that broke it open was in terms of being sensationalized, was the O.J. Simpson,
the O.J. Simpson
White
trial.
Bronco
Yes,
thing.
I do remember
and
that.
Then everything
And that goes to Anna Casper's point because I mean there's that iconic footage of people, iconic or like absurd footage of the a helicopter following a car on the highway. Remember that? And that's just filling space. So Anna Casper made a good point there. So I'll try to keep this up. I finally figured out how I did this the last time. I guess I wasn't paying attention though, so I didn't know, and I don't see when Anna Casper said that. I don't know if he's still on yet, but we'll get better at this. But your last point was I guess about as optimistic as we can get.
Okay. And I do think, I will just add that I do think in our private lives, we do prize virtue over vice.
I agree. No, I agree. I think you're right about that. Okay. Well, thanks for joining. And we do this every 2 weeks, and we'll see you next time.